The Manchester Chartist, Chapter 3. By 9 o'clock, Bess and Daniel Ackroyd had long since bade farewell to Tom and retired to bed. Both would rise at 5 in the morning, Bess to face another day of wage slavery in Gibraltar Mill, the next 12 hours of her working life at the service of and governed by the speed of the spinning mule, whilst Daniel continued to tramp around Manchester, hoping to find a sign saying, "Hands wanted." If he couldn't find work as a carpenter or a joiner, he'd try anything. Matthew Etherell, the owner of Gibraltar Cotton Mill, had neither the need nor the inclination to rise so early. He'd just finished a splendid meal in the company of his 19-year-old daughter, Irene Rose, and his guest, Nathaniel West, and his good lady wife, Emma. Nathaniel, a fair-haired, blue-eyed, rather brash, self-opinionated young man of 21 years, managed the Nelson Mill, situated next to Matthew's on Loom Street in Ancoats, on behalf of his father, who owned 2 other mills, one in Bolton and one in Salford. He liked to inform strangers he was a self-made man, although Matthew knew he hardly had the capacity to make a decent fart. Unlike the Wests, Matthew was in a good mood. Evidently earlier in the day, Nathaniel and his beloved had threaded their way through the commercial district to attend a memorial service at the Collegiate Church off Fennell Street. They'd emerged just in time to witness the shoemakers' contingent passing by. One of the banners these fustian-coated specimens of the low classes proudly carried bore the slogan, "Remember Peterloo," with the words liberty, equality, fraternity emblazoned beneath. To make matters worse, the workmen wore headgear that looked suspiciously like the symbol of the French Revolution, the cap of liberty, which their banner also portrayed. Nathaniel, being a loyal subject of the Crown, had taken great exception to this Republican message, and told them in no uncertain terms they should bugger off back to France. One of the shoemakers had smiled, and much to the amusement of his friends and a gang of onlookers, replied, "Mais non, monsieur. Promenade avec us up to Kersamore. You can help us check out guillotine sharp, if you care to stick your neck out." Both Matthew and his daughter failed to suppress their laughter on hearing this news from the lips of their guest, much to West's chagrin. "My advice is not to provoke the operatives," Matthew responded. "The fact is they have a just cause, and it's time the manufacturers, of which I am one and you're another, took cognizance of the situation." Nathaniel couldn't believe his ears, and even Irene Rose was somewhat surprised at her father's response, albeit pleasantly. "You'll be supporting their demands for a 10-hour day next," the guest spluttered. "And why not?" Matthew replied. "If all the manufacturers agreed to it, would it be such a great problem?" Young Mr. West responded with a silent look of disbelief. "Making men, women and children work until they drop is hardly conducive to maintaining their health or our production of goods," Matthew continued, answering his own question. "When the weaver James Hargreaves, back in 1764, invented the spinning jenny, it wasn't with the intention of impoverishing his fellow workers and binding them to a machine for 12 or 14 hours a day. It was to make life easier for himself and them." "And what will they do with this extra time on their hands?" his fellow manufacturer retorted sharply. "They'll resort to the gin shops and beer taverns. That's what they'll do." Matthew Etherell shook his head. It was an argument he'd heard often, and a weak, patronising and hypocritical one at that, coming from Nathaniel's lips, a young rake, well known for bouts of drunkenness. It smacked of humbug. "The reason they frequent such places is because they have little alternative. They supply small beer and other beverages relatively safe to drink, free from sewage and animal excrement. They're also one of the few places where they can relax and engage in social intercourse with their fellow human beings after a hard day's mind-numbing labour." "They could spend time with their wives and children, surely," Mrs. West protested. Once more Matthew shook his head. Have you ever visited the homes of any of the operatives working in your father-in-law's mill, Mrs. West?" he asked. She looked at him blankly, the whole idea being either too frightful and perhaps too horrific to contemplate, or simply beyond her comprehension. Matthew smiled and shook his head once more. "No, I suppose you won't have done so. The hovels they're reduced to living in, and not for those with a delicate stomach or weak constitution," he remarked. "Most of them, if not all of them, are not fit to spend any length of time in. They're sleeping shelters, nothing more, and poor ones at that. The housing provision in this town is a disgrace, and needs speedy attention. The beasts of the field enjoy more comfort. However, that will take time. In the meantime, there's much that could be done to provide facilities which will be attractive to our operatives, speedily and cheaply, where they could spend any extra leisure time in a healthy and enlightening way." Nathaniel eyed Matthew up, glaring at him. "By their very nature, the working classes are their own worst enemy. They're feckless and profligate," he remonstrated. "They spend all the good money we pay them as soon as they obtain it. They have no understanding of the need to be thrifty, to save and put something to one side in order to make provision for a rainy day. They don't attend church. They're atheists and drunkards." "All the good money we pay them?" Matthew laughed at the very idea. "They're lucky enough to earn enough to provide themselves with the bare means of subsistence. If you can teach them how to save anything out of the derisory amount you pay them, after they've bought their starvation diet, paid their rent, and bought needle and thread to patch their ragged clothes, I will personally double every penny you can prove they can save." He paused before adding, "As for going to church, Sunday's the one day they have to themselves, the one day we allow them a little rest, and to be human for a few precious hours. Once they've used up time doing their domestic chores, and washing their ragged clothes, why on earth should they waste any precious time left to them on their knees, praying in a church that's a spiritual arm of their oppressors, listening to some well-fed and overpaid preacher assuring them of good times ahead once they're dead and buried?" At this point he seemed to have rendered Mr. West speechless once again, but Matthew hadn't finished. "The undeniable fact is, Nathaniel, it's the working people who transform nature's bounty to provide our wealth. As the economist William Petty wrote, long before Adam Smith plagiarized him and only got it half right, nature is the mother of all wealth, and labour its father. It's their labour that ensures our comforts, our leisure, and all the trappings of civilization we take for granted." Nathaniel's mouth began to open, but he seemed to have second thoughts. Matthew continued in full flow. "It's our anarchic economic system that makes a god of so-called free market forces, and our insatiable greed that denies our operatives any real share in the wealth they produce. It's our system that grinds them into the dust and forces them into a quagmire of despond. That's the truth of it. When you go home to your nice, well-appointed mansion, and your maids and servants, your clean linen and your feather beds, read your Bible, and then come back to me and explain how its teachings justify such a situation." "What did you mean, Father, when you said facilities could be provided where operatives could spend any extra leisure time in a healthy and enlightening way?" "Well, for example, many, although nowhere near enough, of the school workers have formed mechanics libraries, clubbing together to buy books in order to educate themselves. Books are subject to heavy taxes. The stamp duties are a tax on knowledge and need repealing. Additionally, we should be doing everything possible to aid our operatives so they can form mechanics institutes, where they can study and encourage other workers and their children to take part in social and educational activities. The costs will be minor and the rewards abundant." "A little knowledge is a dangerous thing," West said grimly, not liking the way the discussion was proceeding one little bit, and finding his opponent's tone more than a little offensive. True, Matthew replied. A little knowledge is undoubtedly a dangerous thing. Our operatives need vast quantities of good quality education and access to fine literature and information, just as they need decent and pleasant housing, nourishing food, and reasonable clothes upon their backs. They have the intellect and the practical capacity to organise it, but they lack the means in all too many cases. We have the means, and it's our duty to provide assistance. West shook his head in profound disagreement, convinced the only suitable education for his hands would teach them to accept their God-given position of servility with due humility. Irene Rose smiled as her father took up his thread. We need to face up to facts, Nathaniel. Sooner or later the demands of the Charter will be met, and when they're met, the working people become our potential masters. We need to encourage them and ensure they're educated, if we're to avoid them taking revenge for all the many calumnies we've heaped about their heads. Because you can be sure of one thing, they're educating themselves slowly but surely, and they're using tracts and penny dreadfuls whose ideas you might find frightful. By now Irene Rose found it difficult to contain herself. She gazed at her father in wonder, respect, and admiration. He in turn locked his eyes onto those of Nathaniel West. 19 years ago last month, this town's leading magistrates disgraced Manchester in the eyes of the civilized world. Peaceful men, women, and children were slashed with sabres, trampled by horses, and crushed to death by panic, on a croft bearing a saint's name. Shelley wrote The Mask of Anarchy as a result, anarchy being his name for laissez-faire economics and the present manufacturing system. Not surprisingly, many workers can recite every single verse word for word, and the scarcely hidden revolutionary message they contain isn't lost on them. He paused, gathering his thoughts. Just 6 years ago, we, the manufacturers, achieved representation in the House of Commons, breaking the monopoly grip of the landed aristocracy over the instruments of government, and making the Commons the sovereign body of our Parliament. We achieved that breakthrough with and because of the support of working people, whose interests we promised to advance, but then betrayed. The massacre and the continuing struggles for parliamentary reform since then made the Great Reform Act of 1832, which gave us that representation, inevitable. We could not and did not achieve it on our own. Manchester now returns 2 members of Parliament. Before 1832 it returned none, whilst Old Sarum in Wiltshire, a town long abandoned and with 1 single voter, returned 2 members. Yet we still deny our operatives their rights. Nathaniel, you're an intelligent man. Try to place yourself in your employee's position and see things from their point of view. Do you really believe the working classes will sit back and allow us, their masters and exploiters, to carry on governing in league with the landowners without any challenge? They know they won the right to vote and to stand for election for us. Now they want those rights for themselves, and I don't blame them. He smiled once more at his opponent. I don't know exactly how many people attended the meeting today to endorse the People's Charter. One of my contacts assures me it was no more than 60,000, whilst others have quoted figures of 120. A journalist friend, employed by the Manchester Advertiser, told me 300,000 attended. Whatever the number, each forsook a much-needed day's wage. Many risked losing their jobs. Furthermore, the number of participants far exceeds the few hundred who at present have the right to elect our 2 Manchester members. Think on that, Nathaniel, and remember, today was only the beginning of a mighty campaign. Monday the 24th of September 1838 is a date that will still be remembered long after we're dead and buried. I hope you're right, Father, Irene Rose said quietly. Her father turned to her. I know I'm right, my dear, just as I know your mother, God rest her soul, would have approved your donation of the silk for the Gibraltar Mill banner. I was proud to see such a magnificent example of our workers' skill and dedication. I intend to offer one of the rooms in the mill for its safe storage. Nathaniel West finally rose from his seat, shaking his head in despair. His fellow mill owner had all too clearly lost control of his faculties. Come, Emma, he said grimly. We've heard enough nonsense for one day, if not a lifetime. Bad enough knowing the working classes are being continuously misled and whipped up into a frenzy by demagogues and union agitators, without being subjected to this kind of rubbish from one of our own class. Irene Rose shook her head and smiled, wondering how her father knew about her gift, and marvelling at his proposal to provide space to store the banner. She paid for the silk from her own savings, and been proud to participate in the banner's manufacture, alongside Bess, Mary Upton and their colleagues. The fact her father had been so positive was an unexpected bonus. She accompanied their guests to the door, wished them good night and a safe journey home, urging them rather mischievously and somewhat untruthfully to keep their eyes open for the disaffected rebels and revolutionaries she'd heard stood at each of the junctions on the road between Hardwick and Didsbury. Unfortunately, Mr. and Mrs. West seemed worried and distracted. They didn't thank her for entertaining them, or bother to wish her good night. Irene Rose shrugged and watched as they climbed into the brougham, patiently waiting for them outside the garden gate. She waved them away and closed the door with a smile as they drove off, before returning to her father. She'd always felt he was rather special, but his performance that night had simply amazed her, and she intended to tell him so.